I was standing in the airport of a foreign country, with only a few crumpled dollars left in my hand. No passport, no phone, no wallet. While my son had already boarded the plane and left as if I had never existed, and the humiliation was not in being abandoned, but in the moment the security officer asked me in front of dozens of strangers, "Sir, were you left behind by your family?" When I realized that my status as a father had just been erased cleanly and efficiently. If you have ever been pushed to the margins by your own family with words that sounded perfectly polite, ever realized a betrayal in a way that left you no time to react, leave a dot in the comments so I know you are listening from somewhere, and follow to keep hearing the stories, where the truth is spoken at the right time, in the right place. I had not gone on a vacation with my son for nearly 7 years. Since the day my wife passed away, everything in the family shifted onto a different trajectory. Jason got married, moved out, then moved back in to live together in my house in Tacoma. I gradually settled into the rhythm of a man in his early 60s, mornings opening the old workshop to check a few leftover documents, afternoons returning home for a simple meal, evenings watching the news until sleep came. No arguments, but no closeness either. Each of us existed alongside the other, like two parallel lines. The trip to Mexico was Jason's idea. "You need a change of scenery, Dad," he said. "Get out of the house for a bit. Go to the beach. Rest." His voice was softer than usual, no longer sharp and clipped like when talking about money or work. Brooke, his wife, sat beside him and nodded as well, her lips forming a smile that was just enough, not warm but not cold either. I hesitated, not because I did not want to go, but because I had long grown used to staying in one place. But Jason had already booked the tickets. The hotel was already chosen. He spoke as if everything had been calculated for me, with only my agreement left. I nodded, partly because I thought I should try stepping out of the old loop, and partly because I wanted to believe that this time my son truly just wanted to take his father on a vacation. We flew through Houston and then connected down to Puerto Vallarta. The flight was long, the seats cramped, and I slept fitfully. As the plane descended, through the window appeared a stretch of blue sea, reaching all the way to the horizon. Sunlight flooded the wing, so bright that I had to squint. Puerto Vallarta was beautifully sunny, blue water. The hotel was not luxurious, but clean enough. The first 3 days passed peacefully. Jason took the initiative to ask whether I was sleeping well on the bed, and whether the food suited my taste. Brooke called me Dad more often than before. Those gestures did not make me happy. They made me feel uneasy. Jason began to ask about documents, not casual inquiries, very specific ones. Where I kept my passport, whether I had copies, whether I still had the original deed to the house, whether I had ever thought about reorganizing my paperwork to make things neater. He spoke in a concerned tone, as if he were thinking about my future. I answered every question honestly, without hiding anything. I had owned a heating and plumbing repair shop for more than 30 years. My whole life, I was used to transparency. If there was something, I said it straight. I never had the habit of doubting my own child. On the morning of our return, we arrived at the airport early. The waiting hall was moderately crowded. Loudspeaker announcements mixed with the sound of suitcases rolling across the tiled floor. I sat down on a row of seats near the gate, placing my backpack at my feet. My passport was in the innermost pocket. I had kept it there since check-in for easy access if needed. Jason and Brooke sat on either side of me. Both were quieter than usual. I noticed Jason holding his phone without really reading it, his fingers scrolling the screen absent-mindedly. Brooke kept folding and unfolding her boarding pass, as if she needed something to occupy her hands to hide her restlessness. "How long until boarding?" I asked. Jason glanced up at the electronic board. "About 90 minutes. I nodded. 90 minutes was neither long nor short. Enough time for a cup of coffee, enough time to buy a few things to bring along. About 20 minutes later, Jason stood up. "Dad," he said, lowering his voice, "can you go buy some water and a few snacks for the flight? You know what we like." I started to stand up out of habit. "I'll go with you." Jason raised his hand, stopping me lightly but firmly. "No need. I have to call a client. Brooke needs to use the restroom." He pulled out his wallet, took out a $20 bill, and placed it in my hand. His fingers were colder than the airport's air conditioning. "Just grab them quickly. It's right over there." I looked at the money, then at my son's face. His eyes slid past me without lingering for even a second. Brooke had already lowered her head to her phone, pretending not to hear the exchange. "All right," I said. "I'll be right back." I did not take my backpack with me. I thought I would only be gone a few minutes and would return to the same spot. I left it under the seat, pushing it in close to my feet before walking away. I had no idea that was the last decision I would make as someone who was allowed to stay. The shop was located between the coffee stand and the currency exchange. I chose bottled water, the kind Jason usually drank, a few protein bars for the long flight, and a bag of dried nuts for Brooke. I was not in a hurry. I was not slow either. Everything happened normally, like hundreds of times I had bought things in other airports. When I returned to the gate, the first thing I noticed was the emptiness. The row of seats where we had been sitting was no longer occupied. Not only were Jason and Brooke gone, but the surrounding area had changed as well. Different suitcases had taken their place. Unfamiliar faces were bent over their own screens. I froze. I looked under the seat. My backpack was still there. An unnamed feeling ran along my spine. I bent down and pulled open the main zipper. The zipper of the innermost pocket was off from where I always left it, as if someone had quickly opened it and closed it again. A spare shirt, a toiletry bag. I opened the innermost pocket, where I always kept my passport. Empty. I opened the outer pocket. No phone. I reached into my pants pocket. My wallet was gone. I checked every compartment, every seam, as if the items might reappear if I were patient enough. There was nothing. I set the bag down on the seat, my hands trembling slightly. I looked around, hoping to see Jason approaching from afar, one hand raised, apologizing for some stupid joke. No one called my name. I walked quickly to the gate counter. "Excuse me," I said to the agent, my own voice sounding strange to my ears. "The couple who was sitting here earlier, where did they go?" She typed a few lines on the computer, her eyes never leaving the screen. "The Evans party, they boarded an earlier flight. They switched to a connection to Denver." It took me a moment to process her words. Denver? We were flying to Seattle. She looked up, her expression shifting from indifferent to sympathetic. "Their tickets were to Denver, sir. The plane took off about 20 minutes ago." 20 minutes. I walked back to the seats and sat down very slowly. I slipped my hand into my pocket and touched a few crumpled bills. $8. What was left after buying water for them? Those thin pieces of paper lay still in my palm, so light they were almost non-existent, yet so heavy they made it hard to breathe. Jason had given me enough money to buy water and taken everything else. I looked at the bag in my hands. 3 bottles of water, a few snacks. I had spent $12 to accommodate my child's habits. I had $8 left. That was my entire world at that moment. I sat in a crowded airport with no documents, no means of contact, no explanation. I was not lost. I was not forgotten. I had been sent away as a house helper sent on an errand, only to have the door locked behind me. I stood still in the middle of the walkway for a moment, as if taking one more step would make everything that had just happened feel more real. People kept passing by me, dragging suitcases, laughing, talking, and making phone calls. No one paid any attention to a man standing in the middle of the boarding gate, holding a bag of food, eyes fixed on the space that had just been left behind. I turned back to the seats. This time I sat down slowly, as if giving my body time to understand what my mind was still refusing to accept. The backpack was still at my feet. I pulled the zipper shut again, more carefully than before, rummaging through every compartment, every seam. The repetition wasn't because I believed my belongings would suddenly reappear, but because I wasn't ready to accept that I had lost everything. A young couple standing nearby glanced at me. The man gently tugged his wife's hand, signaling her to move aside. I realized I had been opening the backpack for too long, my hands trembling, my eyes no longer looking normal. I closed the bag, set it on the seat, and tried to take a deep breath to keep my breathing from breaking apart. I stood up and returned to the boarding counter. The employee from earlier was talking to someone else. I waited, my hands clenched together. "Excuse me," I said when she turned back. "Could you check again for me? Have they really left?" She looked at the screen, then at me, this time more carefully. "Yes, sir. They switched to a connecting flight to Denver. Checked in standby. The plane has already taken off." "Did they leave any message?" She shook her head gently and decisively. "No." I nodded. I thanked her with the kind of polite phrase I'd used out of habit for decades in business. She replied with a professional smile. The exchange ended there, neat and contained, as if everything had been fully resolved. I went back to the waiting area. At this point, I was no longer searching for Jason in the crowd. I knew I wouldn't see him. I reached into my pants pocket. Loose bills brushed against my fingertips. I pulled them out and laid them on my palm. $8. The amount left after I had bought exactly the kind of drink Jason liked, and the pack of nuts Brooke always ate. The thin bills rested lightly in my hand, so light that if the wind were a little stronger, they might have been swept away. I looked at them for a moment, then folded them and put them back in my pocket. Not because I was attached to them, but because I didn't know what else to do. I lifted my head. In front of me was a vast terminal, with high ceilings and white lights evenly cast. Everything was clean, orderly, and operating exactly as designed. Only I stood outside that trajectory. A security officer walked past, slowed when he saw me stand up, and sat back down. He asked in a polite tone, familiar with scenes of displacement, "Sir, were you left behind by your family?" I lost a beat before answering. The question was simple, with no hidden meaning, but by the time it reached my ears, it was no longer just about a flight. "Yes," I replied, "I am." I said it in clear, rounded English, as if I had always been traveling alone. He nodded, gestured toward the assistant's desk, and said I could ask there if I needed anything. I thanked him and returned to my seat. By habit, I reached toward my chest pocket, where I always kept my phone. My fingertips touched space. The motion stopped halfway. I lowered my hand and stared straight ahead. Some habits need only 1 second to betray us. I stood up and walked toward the restroom, not because I needed to use it, but because I needed an enclosed space for my mind to stop spinning. The mirror hung on a brightly lit wall. I looked at the man in it. The collar of my shirt was wrinkled. Gray threaded through my neatly cut hair. My eyes were tired, but still alert. There was nothing about me that looked lost, nor did I look drunk or deranged. I stared at myself longer than necessary, and in that moment I understood what had been weighing down my chest since I returned to the gate. I wasn't lost. I had been removed. Not a scheduling mistake, not a misunderstanding of departure time, not an accident. Someone had decided that I didn't need to appear in the next part of this journey anymore. I washed my face, dried my hands, and stepped back out. When the door closed behind me, the sound of the terminal rushed back in, seamless and uninterrupted. The world didn't stop just because I had been erased from a plan. I returned to the seat and sat down, my back straighter than before. The $8 in my pocket hadn't changed, but the way I looked at them had. This was no longer a situation that needed explaining. This was a choice someone had made on my behalf. And as I sat there, in the middle of the crowded terminal, I understood that what had just happened wasn't an incident. It was the first step of something that had been calculated long in advance. I left the waiting area when the afternoon was already setting in. Sunlight slanted through the tall glass panels, stretching people's shadows across the tiled floor. I walked slowly, not because I was tired, but because every step now had to be considered. I had lost the right to move on instinct. The security desk was at the end of the corridor. An officer in a dark blue uniform looked up when I explained the situation. I spoke briefly, without detours. My son had taken my passport, my phone, and my wallet. They left ahead of me. I was left behind. He listened, took notes, and then asked whether I had any other documents to confirm my identity. I shook my head. That answer, though I had rehearsed it many times in my mind, still dried my throat when I said it out loud. They took me to a smaller room. There I repeated the story to a local police officer. He spoke slowly, using simple words, to make sure I understood. I understood everything. I only lacked the things needed to prove who I was. A report was filed with the title, Theft by Family Member. The phrase was printed in bold on the paper. I stared at it for a moment. Family, in this frame, became a legal detail. I signed at the bottom of the page with my familiar handwriting, the same way I used to sign contracts back when I was in business. That sensation made me smile, bitterly. The officer handed me a copy, along with instructions. You need to go to American Citizen Services, the U.S. Consular Office. They handle cases of citizens who lose documents. I asked for directions. He pointed to a map on the wall, a 15-minute walk. I slipped the paper into my jacket pocket, where I used to keep my phone. Now, that space was empty. The road leading out of the airport was crowded and loud. Street vendors called out, taxis honked, tourists clustered together planning their next move. I walked through all of it like someone without a role in this picture. The sun was harsher than I expected. I stopped to buy the cheapest bottle of water, using almost all the money I had left. The American Citizen Services Office was in a low building with a plain facade. The American flag hung out front, fluttering lightly in the wind. I stood looking at it for a few seconds before going inside, not out of emotion, but because I needed a breath to organize my thoughts. Inside was cooler. A middle-aged woman sat behind the service desk. The nameplate in front of her read, Patricia Henderson. She looked at me, her eyes alert, not probing, not rushed. "How can we help you?" she asked. I told her everything for the third time that day. This time I spoke more slowly, more orderly. Strangely, each time I told it, the story lost a little emotion, as if I were grinding it down into a report. Patricia nodded, taking notes. When I finished, she set her pen down. "We need to verify your identity," she said. "You don't have documents, so we'll have to use stored data and security questions." She asked for my date of birth, place of birth, and social security number. I answered. She continued asking about my old passport, year of issue, place of issue, and the emergency contact I had listed. That information lived somewhere in my memory, not used often, but still intact. Patricia entered the data, cross-checking on the screen. Occasionally, she looked up to confirm a detail. Finally, she nodded. "We've confirmed that you are a United States citizen," she said. "The next step is an emergency passport." She handed me 2 forms, DS-11 and DS-64, one to apply for a new passport, one to report the loss. I sat at the adjacent table, pen in hand. My hand was steady. I filled in each box, each line, carefully, the way I used to keep the books for my shop years ago. When it came to the fee, I looked up. I told the truth. I didn't have enough money left. Patricia didn't seem surprised. She explained the repatriation assistance program. I would receive an advance to cover what I needed to get home, along with a promissory note. Once I was back, I would be responsible for repayment. I signed again. The paper was thin, but its contents were heavy enough for me to clearly feel where I now stood. While waiting for the paperwork to be processed, Patricia asked one more question. Her voice was still even, procedural, but the question was different. "In the United States, who is responsible for you?" I didn't answer right away. A few names passed through my mind, then stopped. I understood. The question wasn't meant to wound. It just needed an answer to complete the file. Me, I said. It's always been me. Patricia looked at me a moment longer, then she nodded and didn't ask anything else. When I left the office, the sunlight had softened. In my hands was a packet of temporary papers, an appointment slip to receive the emergency passport, and a debt that had just begun. I stepped down the front steps, paused, and watched the traffic flow by. I had no identification. I had no phone. I had no family standing as my sponsor. But I had one thing clearer than I did that morning. If I wanted to go home, I would have to take myself there. The first night at the hostel passed more slowly than I expected. The shared room had 6 bunk beds, the smell of laundry soap mixing with the salty dampness of the sea. People came and went quietly, each carrying their own story. I chose the lower bunk in the corner, placed my backpack tight against my feet, and lay there staring up at the ceiling, washed in yellow light. The fan turned steadily. The sound was not loud enough to drown out the thoughts that began to crowd in. When everything outside settled, my memory opened a compartment I had tried all day to avoid. The images came back clearly, without being summoned. 6 weeks earlier, Jason stopped by the house one afternoon. He brought food from our usual place, the kind of sandwich I always chose when I was busy. The way he set the bag on the table and pulled out a chair across from me was exactly like every other time. The only difference was, that day, he stayed longer. After we ate, Jason opened his laptop. The screen lit up in the kitchen, covering half his face. "Dad, I want to update a few documents for you," he said calmly. "Medical stuff, just in case something unexpected happens." I listened and nodded. At my age, those words were nothing unusual. Jason continued, explaining medical decision rights and emergencies. Everything sounded reasonable, familiar. He scrolled through pages, pointed out where I needed to sign, and reminded me this was standard procedure. I did not read every line, not because I was rushed, but because I trusted him, trusted the way he spoke, trusted that he was my son, trusted that no one would need to deceive me with something so complicated. "Let's sign at Starbucks. It's more convenient," Jason suggested. "There's a notary there." We walked to the corner. The cafe was moderately busy. The smell of roasted coffee, the sound of grinders, names being called out evenly. The notary arrived shortly after, a middle-aged man in a neat shirt, glasses resting low on his nose. He checked the documents, asked a few questions to confirm identity, then placed the stack of papers on the table. "Sign here," he said, pointing a finger to the blank line. I took the pen. The ink touched the paper, familiar, fluid, no shaking, no hesitation. Jason stood beside me, watching. The notary stamped, signed, and neatly gathered the documents. "All done," Jason said. "I'll keep a copy for you." I nodded. We left the cafe like everyone else. No moment made me think I had just handed over something larger than the original explanation. Lying on the hostel bed, I turned my head and looked at the empty bunk beside me. The small details of that day began to rearrange themselves. The way Jason chose the cafe, the fact that the notary never offered me a copy. The papers were being collected immediately without asking whether I wanted to keep them. I sat up, my back against the wall. In my head, I replayed every step. Everything followed the procedure. There was a signature. There was no notarization. There were real documents. Only one thing was missing: the truth about their contents. I remembered what Jason said when he handed me the pen. Just a medical update. At the time, I heard it and believed it. I was never told I was signing away anything else. Never warned about the consequences. Never given the chance to reconsider. A cold sensation spread from my chest down my arms. Not panic. Delayed clarity. I understood why Jason did not need an electronic signature. Why did he choose to meet a notary in person? Why did everything move fast, clean, without giving me time to ask more questions? I had signed a legal document, but the explanation that came with it was not legal. I lay back down, staring at the ceiling again. The fan still turned, steady as before. But in my mind, one door had just closed, revealing another corridor behind it. What happened at the airport was not an impulsive decision. It was the next step of a plan that began the day I put my signature on paper in that coffee shop. And now I know I have to take back what was taken from me, starting with the signature I once trusted enough to give away. On the morning of the second day at the hostel, I woke up before the alarm rang. The room was still dim. A few people were sleeping, blankets pulled up to their chins. I sat up, put on my shoes, slung on my backpack, and went out to the common area. There was a scratched wooden table there, just big enough to spread out paperwork. I set my consular file down, poured some water, and sat up straight. I realized I was no longer panicking. Yesterday's emptiness had receded, replaced by a familiar state. The thing I had used to run a small shop for decades. Calm, order, decision. I took out a pen and wrote a short list along the edge of the paper. Identity, money, house, 3 items. No more, no less. The first item, identity, already had a path forward. The consulate had been clear. An emergency passport would take 5 business days. There would be checks, verification, appointments. I had signed all the paperwork, accepted the repatriation loan. My job now was to wait for the right time and show up at the right place. The second item, money, was more complicated. I opened my wallet and counted again. After yesterday's bottle of water, I had exactly a small amount of loose change left. Enough for a simple breakfast, nothing more. I calculated quickly. The hostel was cheap. One more night was manageable. The consulate had mentioned emergency assistance for basic needs. I noted the time I would need to return to the office to ask further. The last item was the house. Thinking about it, my hand stopped on the page. The house in Seattle-Tacoma was not just a place to live. It was the largest asset I owned, the place where I repaired every step, replaced every pipe, paid every loan. Jason lived there without paying rent. I'd called it helping my child, never once considering it a risk. I underlined the word house twice. At noon, I returned to American Citizen Services right on schedule. Patricia looked at me and recognized me immediately. She updated the file status, reconfirmed the information, told me to keep the schedule unchanged. 5 days. No faster, no slower. I asked about living assistance. She guided me through another short form. I signed, this time reading every line carefully. Leaving the office, I stopped at a small internet cafe. Old computers, sticky keyboards. I logged into my email, something I rarely used. In the inbox were a few familiar notices. Utility bills, monthly bank statements. I opened each one and checked carefully. The account was still intact. No strange transactions. No change of beneficiary. I let out a lighter breath. Jason had taken documents and personal items, but he had not touched the money. I added another note to the list. Account secure. For now. I used the remaining time to do something else. I called the airline, asked about flights back to SeaTac, then onward to Tacoma. I did not book yet. I needed to know where Jason was. I recalled what he had mentioned before the trip. Denver, work, a meeting. I chose the earliest flight after the day I would receive the emergency passport. More expensive than usual, but within reach. I saved the flight code, did not pay. I needed certainty at every step. That evening I returned to the hostel. I ate a simple meal with a few strangers. They asked where I was from. I answered briefly. No one needed to hear my long story right now. I went back to my bed, took out the paper, and reviewed the list. Identity, in progress. Money, sufficient, with a plan. House, requires direct action. I thought about warning Jason, about calling the neighbors, about finding a lawyer from afar. Each idea appeared, then I pushed it aside. Every one of those options shared one thing. They would tell Jason that I was not truly stuck. I understood the most important thing I still had. Time. Jason believed I was still in Mexico, confused, waiting, dependent. He believed I could not return immediately. That belief was my only advantage right now. If I broke it too soon, everything would become harder. I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket. The lights in the room were mostly off. The fan hummed steadily. I lay down, no longer tossing like the night before. In my mind, the plan had taken shape. I did not need speed. I needed timing. Because when everything has been taken from you, the only thing left with value is surprise. 5 days later, I returned to the consulate and received the emergency passport and the repatriation ticket. From there, I took a ride back to Tacoma. The sky was overcast, clouds hanging low. The kind of weather so familiar made me feel lighter the moment the wheels touched the runway. I walked out into the arrivals hall with a compact backpack and a thin stack of papers. No one was waiting. That fit the plan. I called for a car. The driver asked about my trip. I answered just enough. When the car turned into the old neighborhood, the familiar houses appeared in the order I had memorized long ago. The maple tree in front of my house was still there, its canopy drooping under the rain. I asked the driver to stop at the corner, paid him, and walked the remaining distance. I didn't want to appear suddenly. The neighbor across the street was watering his plants. He looked up, squinted, then set the hose down. "Frank, you're back early?" His voice carried real surprise, not polite small talk. "I changed flights," I said. "Where's Jason?" The neighbor hesitated, just a beat, but enough for me to notice. "That kid, he moved out a few days ago, early morning, around 6:15. Small truck. I saw him when I just opened the door." "Moved out?" I repeated, keeping my tone even. "Yeah. Boxes, suitcases. Looked rushed." I waved, but he didn't look over. I nodded and thanked him. We exchanged a few more words about the weather, as if the conversation hadn't carried anything of consequence. When I turned away, I knew I had just received the first piece of the puzzle. The front gate was still locked. I entered the security code. The familiar sound followed. The door opened. The system hadn't been changed. That meant Jason believed I couldn't possibly be back yet. I stepped inside. The air smelled different. Not exactly foreign, but lacking. Lacking the things that had been present long enough to become part of the background. The living room was emptier. My father's wall clock was gone. The glass cabinet was still there, but clear gaps showed where the family china used to sit. I stood still, looking around, registering each detail as if taking inventory. The bedroom was still neat, but the nightstand drawer was empty. My wife's jewelry box was gone. In the study, the old camera I'd kept since my youth was no longer on the shelf. The watch case sat half open, empty inside. I didn't touch anything yet. I walked through slowly, letting everything reveal itself. It wasn't anger driving me now, but clarity. The items taken weren't random household things. They held value, both monetary and remembered. I went into the file room. I pulled out the tax file drawer looking for old statements. Among the thick folders, it wasn't hidden. It wasn't locked, as if whoever put it there believed I would no longer be capable of coming back to open this drawer. I saw a thin envelope lying between two stacks of papers. Not something I normally kept there. I took it out and opened it. Inside was a cleanly printed document on heavy paper, bearing a notary seal. The title stood at the top of the page, Deed of Gift. My name appeared as the grantor, Jason's name as the grantee. The house address was fully listed. The date matched the morning at the cafe. The line reading, "Consideration, love, and affection," sat just below, cold and complete. I read slowly, not skipping a single line. My signature was at the bottom, the familiar stroke of ink, the notary seal placed neatly beside it. Everything was formally correct. I set the papers down on the desk and sat back in the chair. In my mind, scattered fragments from days earlier connected on their own. The trip, the airport, the 6:15 morning. The belongings cleared out before I could return. The house hadn't moved from its foundation. The key still opened the door, but on paper it had already changed hands. I stood up and went to the window overlooking the front yard. A light rain fell. The maple tree swayed gently. Everything looked as calm as ever. Only one thing was different. From this moment on, I understood that what had been taken wasn't just property. Ownership itself had been transferred out of my hands with a concealed signature. And this was the proof. I set the stack of papers down on the table, stood up, and did the first thing that needed to be done: establish the current state. I took the backup camera from the drawer, the one Jason didn't know I still kept. I went room by room, photographing the empty spaces on the shelves, half-open drawers, the empty watch box. I didn't search further, I only documented. Each photo was a timestamp. I photographed the file envelope as well, the notarization seal, the signatures. I photographed the security system screen showing it was active under my name. When I was done, I put the camera away, sat down, and called a local locksmith. I chose one with an office nearby, fast arrival, clean work. The locksmith's van pulled up in front of the house less than 40 minutes later. He got out, stocky build, tool belt on. I handed over the paperwork, pointed to the security code, explained briefly. He checked, nodded. "Replace everything," I said. "Front door, back door, garage." He worked quietly, metal against metal, old locks removed, new ones installed. I stood beside him, watching, testing every bolt when he finished. 3 new sets of keys were placed on the table. I tested every door. Open, close, lock, smooth. When the locksmith left, I pulled a chair onto the porch and sat down. Gray sky, light wind. I waited. Not because I wanted a confrontation, but because I knew it would happen. Jason's car turned into the driveway in the late afternoon. He got out, walked quickly to the front door. I watched from the porch. He inserted the key, turned it. Once, twice. The lock didn't move. Jason frowned, tried another key. Same result. "What the hell is this?" he said out loud. He went around to the back. I heard metal hit the lock, then nothing. A stretch of silence, long enough for me to picture his face tightening. Footsteps rushed back toward the front porch. This time the knocking was harder. I stood up, opened the door, but didn't step outside. I stayed in the doorway, letting the afternoon light fall straight across my face. Jason looked at me. For a very brief moment, every expression drained from his face. His eyes widened beyond normal. His jaw dropped, then snapped shut. He stared at me like he was looking at something that should not exist here, at this moment. "Dad," he said, but the word didn't fully come out. Brooke stopped behind him. Her hand clenched the strap of her bag, then released it, as if her mind was trying to catch up to what had just happened. Jason flicked a glance into the house, then back at me. That look was no longer simple surprise. It was calculation, abruptly cut off. "What are you doing?" Jason said, his voice pitching higher than usual. "This is my house." A few nearby doors cracked open. The neighbor across the street stepped onto his porch. Another person stood at the end of the walkway, pretending to water plants. No one said anything, but everyone watched. "You say it's your house," I replied, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "So why did last month's property tax still come out of my account?" Jason froze. He glanced around, realizing he no longer had privacy. Brooke stood beside him, tugged his arm, whispered something. Jason shook her off. "You don't have the right to change the locks," he said. "I have paperwork." "So do I replied. "And I have the tax receipts, the insurance bills, and the security system registered in my name." Jason's face flushed. He pulled out his phone and dialed. I held his gaze, didn't step back. The phone rang. He lifted it to his ear, spoke quickly. I didn't need to hear the words. The change in how he spoke was enough. "Call whoever you want," I said. "This door doesn't open with old keys today." A neighbor stepped closer, her voice soft but clear. "What's going on?" Jason turned, about to answer. Brooke grabbed his arm again, harder this time. He stopped. The silence stretched long enough for everyone to piece the story together themselves. Jason lowered the phone. He looked at me, his voice dropping. "You really think this is right?" "I think what's right is restoring order," I said. "This house is under dispute, and when there's a dispute, the person paying the taxes and insurance has the right to secure the property." Jason stepped back once. He understood that in front of witnesses, every extra word worked against him. Brooke whispered again. Jason nodded, turned away, walked to the car. Before getting into the driver's seat, he looked back. "This isn't over." "I know," I said, "but it's no longer on your terms." The car drove off. The neighbors dispersed. The man across the street nodded at me, asked nothing more. I closed the door, locked it with the new lock, listened to the bolt slide cleanly into place. I turned back inside, did another round of checks. Lock solid, windows secure. I put one set of keys into my jacket pocket, the others into a drawer different from the old one. Outside, the neighborhood returned to its usual rhythm. Inside, control had changed hands in a way everyone had seen. No loudspeaker, no shouting, just a door that did not open in front of a small crowd, and for the first time since the airport, I knew I had taken my position back. The next morning, I left the house earlier than usual. The air was still damp from the night rain, the sidewalk reflecting streetlights that hadn't yet gone out. I carried a thin file folder, but heavy enough to remind me that everything had moved into a different phase. What I felt now wasn't anger. It was focus. The law office was on the 12th floor of an old building. The elevator moved slowly, the cable grinding dryly. The nameplate outside read, "Margaret Chen, Elder Law and Real Estate Litigation." I chose her for the last two words. Property disputes aren't purely family matters. They're a paperwork game. Margaret was petite, hair neatly tied back, her voice steady and firm. She invited me to sit and placed a cup of coffee in front of me, untouched. I handed her the file. She didn't ask much at first, just flipped through each page, reading carefully, occasionally making notes. 10 minutes passed in silence. "This document," she said, tapping the tip of her pen on the deed of gift, "is formally valid. It's notarized, signed, dated." I nodded. I had prepared myself for that. "But," she continued, "if you signed it under misleading circumstances about its content, we have grounds to argue fraud and misrepresentation, not denying the signature, but denying how it was obtained." She asked me every detail of the signing, which cafe, who was present, where the notary came from, how it was explained to me, whether I received a copy. I answered slowly and clearly. Each answer she placed into its proper legal box. "Your strength," Margaret said, "is the chain of actions, signing under the pretense of a medical update, then the trip, then being abandoned, then the early morning move-out. They all connect." She looked at me without pity. "Your weakness is timing. Your son has filed for immediate possession." I looked up. She slid a copy of the filing toward me. Jason was asking the court to let him move in right away, claiming the lawful owner was being denied access to the property. Cold language, written to make me look like a squatter. "We'll respond," Margaret said, "but fast and clean." She proposed the strategy. File an emergency motion for an injunction to preserve the status quo. Add a sworn statement about being abandoned at the airport. Attach a list of removed property. Include tax and insurance receipts in my name. Each item was a puzzle piece. Miss one, and the picture weakens. Fees were stated plainly. The number wasn't small. I didn't hesitate. I signed the representation agreement. This time, I read every line. Leaving the office, I received a message from my neighbor. They were back in the neighborhood last night, stood outside for a while, then left. I replied briefly, thanking him. Everything was unfolding as expected. That afternoon, Margaret called again. "There's one more thing," she said. "Your daughter-in-law posted online." I asked her to send screenshots. The post was carefully crafted, emotional. She told a story about an elderly father who had changed, who locked his children out, who was occupying property he had already given away. Below it were divided comments. some supportive, some skeptical. My name was pulled into conversations among people who had never met me. "Don't respond," Margaret warned. "Anything you write right now can be reused against you." I turned off the screen. The smear didn't shake me. It only confirmed they were missing something else: legal leverage. When people can't win on paper, they often try to win through public opinion. That evening, I reorganized the files at home. I placed each document in chronological order: signing, the trip, the airport, returning, the locks changed, the lawsuit, the social media post, everything lined up, like chess pieces already in position. I looked out the window. Lights in neighboring houses turned on, one square at a time. Life around me kept moving. Mine had shifted to a different board. Jason believed one document was enough to push me out of my home. Brooke believed a few sentences were enough to define me to strangers. They forgot one basic thing. Once the law is involved, the story no longer belongs to whoever tells it best, but to whoever can prove the truth. I closed the file and placed the new keys on the table. The game had officially begun, and this time I had someone on my side, a clear plan, and time as an ally. The days ahead wouldn't be easy, but they would move in the right direction. 3 days after filing the emergency petition, Margaret called me back to her office. Her voice on the phone was clipped and low. "We're entering the discovery phase," she said. "From here on out, it's no longer just stories." I arrived early. 3 case files of varying thickness were already stacked on the conference table. Margaret pulled out a chair and opened the first folder. "Jason's finances," she said. "What he didn't tell you." She handed me copies of credit card statements. The numbers were unmistakable. Balances steadily rising over 6 months, multiple cash advances, high interest. One card was maxed out. A personal loan was past due. I read line by line and felt a familiar pattern, the kind of money rotation used by someone running out of air. At the same time, Margaret continued, we found early contact with a real estate broker. She slid a chain of emails toward me, Jason asking about pricing, procedures, closing timelines. The timestamps began before the day he signed the papers at the cafe. The wording was cautious, but the intent was clear. I leaned back in my chair. Everything clicked into place. The paperwork was not a backup plan. It was a calculated financial exit. Margaret moved to the second folder. The court approved a limited subpoena for emails and messages within a 6-week window around the signing date, she said. Only content directly related to the house and the trip. The file showed an exchange between Jason and Brooke, extracted from a personal email account under court order, complete with service provider verification. Not speculation. Certified copies. One short message stood out, sent to Brooke 2 days before the flight. Once the papers are done, Dad will leave. Then I'll take care of the house cleanly. No further explanation was needed. The words stood on their own, because they existed before I was left behind at the airport. That morning I woke before the alarm, not from nerves, but because my body had grown used to vigilance. I made coffee, took a small sip, then opened the case file and checked it one last time. Every page sat exactly where it should. Everything had to be that way, because today no one would be listening with sympathy. They would be listening to evidence. Margaret met me at the entrance of the county courthouse. The building was tall, gray stone, the hallways echoing with the steady click of shoes. The security scanner beeped when I set my keys in the tray. I looked around and suddenly realized something unpleasant. People were looking at me the way they look at a family mess, not a crime. Brooke had done that well online. Her posts were not just to smear me. They built public pressure, preloading a story about an unstable father, to cover the real reason Jason was drowning in debt. Margaret leaned in, speaking softly enough for only me to hear. Today, don't look at them. Only look at the judge. Only answer the questions. Don't argue. The courtroom doors opened. I walked in and saw Jason sitting across the aisle with his lawyer. Brooke sat close beside him, phone in hand like a talisman. Jason glanced at me, then looked away, acting as if we were just two strangers dragged into a civil dispute. I looked at that face and remembered the numbers in the discovery file. Maxed out credit cards, overdue personal loans, emails to a real estate broker dated before the signing. This was not recklessness. This was a calculated financial exit. I sat down. My heart was pounding but steady. I heard Margaret's pen touch paper. I heard chairs scrape. I even heard someone whisper Jason's name from the back row. Everything felt like a performance, except the outcome would decide whether this place was still called my home. "All rise," the clerk said. The judge entered, a woman in her early 50s, hair neatly pinned, eyes unsoftened. She scanned both tables without expression. When she sat, the room fell completely still, the kind of silence where every word carries a price. Margaret stood to present first. She did not ramble. She laid the facts along a timeline. The signing under misrepresentation, being abandoned at the airport, returning to find property removed, changing the locks to preserve the status quo, followed by Jason's petition for immediate possession. She emphasized two words: deception and a pattern of conduct. She also made the financial motive clear: rapidly increasing debt over 6 months, contact with a broker before the signing date, and pressure for immediate cash to avoid a credit collapse. Jason's lawyer rose to respond. He spoke smoothly. He turned everything into a family misunderstanding, a voluntary gift, a father changing his mind. He avoided the airport incident like a stain. He focused on the paper, a signature, notarized, end of story. The judge looked directly at Jason. "You're asking this court for immediate possession of the property, correct?" Jason stood. He adjusted his collar and stepped to the witness stand. I watched him walk and suddenly saw what I had not wanted to admit. My son had trained lying into a skill sharpened by being denied money, by rejected emails, by the pressure to maintain the image of success, while his finances steadily collapsed. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore the oath. His voice was calm. "Mr. Evans," his lawyer asked, "did you force your father to sign this document?" "No," Jason answered immediately. "He understood. He wanted me stable. He said it was a gift." Margaret wrote. I watched the judge. The judge watched Jason, then the file, unhurried. His lawyer continued, guiding him. "Did you abandon your father at the airport?" Jason frowned, performing surprise. "We went to the restroom. When we came back, he was gone. We looked. We asked. He may have gone to the wrong gate." A convenient lie, just like the way he had conveniently signed away my future. I heard murmurs. Brooke bowed her head as if grieving. She pressed a hand to her chest, perfectly cast as a long-suffering victim. Margaret stood to cross-examine. Her voice was not loud, but it was sharp. "Jason, you said you looked for your father. How long did you search?" Jason replied, "Maybe about 20 minutes. 20 minutes, Margaret repeated, "while your flight was changed to a Denver route, and you departed." "Before the original boarding time," Jason blinked. "We were notified there was an open seat." "Notified," Margaret said, "or arranged." Opposing counsel objected. The judge raised a hand. "Let the witness answer." Jason swallowed. "I did not arrange it." Margaret did not argue. She moved on, like hammering nails one by one. "Did you have your father's passport?" "No." "Did you have his wallet and phone?" "No." Margaret nodded as if noting it. Then she took out another document. "Then I submit to the court the sworn statement from airport security and the local police report stating that Mr. Frank's passport, wallet, and phone were taken during approximately 14 minutes after he left his seat, and the only people remaining there were you and your wife." Jason shook his head. "I didn't do it." Margaret turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we ask to play audio and video extracted from the front porch doorbell camera at my client's home." Jason's lawyer jumped up. "Objection. Authenticity of the recording." Margaret remained calm. This is a fixed security camera, installed at the home, triggered automatically by motion. It is not a secret recording in a private space. The judge nodded. Play it. The sound filled the courtroom. My voice on the file sounded strange, harder than in life. Then Jason's voice, clear, sharp, without worry. He said the line I had heard with my own ears, but hearing it again in court felt like being struck a second time. The paperwork is valid. This house is mine. Dad is the one occupying it. Brooke whipped around toward Jason. Jason stood frozen, his face draining pale. Margaret did not stop. Your Honor, we have one more matter. She handed up a new packet. Last night, pursuant to a search warrant already issued, police opened a storage unit registered to Jason Evans. A small shock rippled through the room. Jason's lawyer looked down at the file, his color changing. Brooke stiffened. Margaret read the list of recovered items. An antique watch, a camera, a silver service, a jewelry box, with serial numbers and insurance photo matches. Those items were not just sentimental. Jason had used them as collateral in short-term loan applications, according to documents seized from the unit. The judge looked at Jason. This time her gaze was no longer inquisitive. It was evaluative. Jason began to speak, his voice breaking. I was just holding them. I planned to return them. You kept them in a rented unit in your name, the judge cut in, not in a closet for safekeeping, and you kept them after your father reported them stolen. Jason turned to his lawyer, as if searching for rescue. The lawyer leaned down, whispering something, his face tightening, like someone who has already received the verdict. Before the judge reads it. The judge flipped a page, then looked up. Her voice was slow, clear, each word dropping onto stone. You did not plan for your father's future. She paused. You planned for his absence. The sentence drained the room of sound. No coughing, no shuffling. Brooke pressed her lips together, eyes red but dry. Jason stood as if nailed in place, staring at the floor. The verdict was issued on a morning of light rain. I sat in the front row, both hands resting on my knees, back straight. There was no longer the feeling of waiting, like in the days before. After the hearing, everything had already taken shape. Today was simply the moment when things were called by their proper name. The judge entered, her voice even without rise or fall. She reread the main points, slowly, item by item, as if stamping approval on a file that had been reviewed many times. The transfer document was declared invalid. The reasons were clearly stated: fraudulent misrepresentation of the contents, serious misconduct by the notary, and a deliberate sequence of actions intended to strip the signer of ownership rights. The signature existed, but voluntary intent did not. The house reverted to its original status, registered fully and entirely in my name. Jason sat on the opposite side, one hand on the table, head bowed low. Brooke was no longer sitting beside him. She had left the courtroom earlier, saying she couldn't handle the pressure. I did not look after her. The judge moved on to the next matter. The file was referred to the prosecutor's office for review of criminal liability related to asset misappropriation, false declarations, and misuse of documents. There was no threat, just a procedural notice. Jason's attorney stood and requested that his client's cooperation be noted. He spoke of Jason's lack of prior convictions, of his desire to make amends. The judge listened, nodded, and then stated briefly that such matters fell under the prosecutor's authority. A few weeks later, Margaret called me. They accepted a plea deal, she said, a suspended sentence, probation, and a felony record on file. I asked only one question. No prison time? No, she replied, but it will follow him for the rest of his life. I hung up and sat still for a while. I did not feel the kind of relief that comes with a big win. I only felt that a stretch of road had closed. What Jason received was not something I asked for. It was the consequence of the choices he made. That evening I put the house back in order. I returned the recovered items to their original places. My father's clock went back on the wall. The camera was placed on the shelf. My wife's jewelry box rested in the bedside drawer. Everything returned to familiar positions, but the feeling was different. I understood that this house had crossed a boundary. The following week, I sat with my lawyer to draft a new will. There was no argument. No long explanations were needed. I requested that Jason be explicitly disinherited from the real estate. Margaret asked if I was sure. I said I had thought long enough. What came next made her look at me longer. I decided to leave the house to a non-profit organization that provides housing for elderly people in hardship. Not immediately. After I pass away, I wanted this place to continue being a safe home for those who had been pushed out after trusting the wrong relatives. The documents were prepared carefully. I read every clause. There was no one standing beside me explaining things on my behalf anymore. I signed, my pen strokes slow and decisive. When I left the office, I walked a long distance. The rain had stopped. The road was still wet, reflecting the pale gray sky. I realized I was no longer carrying the feeling that I had to prove anything. Justice did not make me young again. It did not give back the days I had lost, but it put everything in its proper place. Those who did wrong bore the consequences. Those who were harmed reclaimed the right to have their own name on their life. I went home, locked the door, turned on the living room light. The clock ticked. The familiar sound rang evenly. I sat down in a chair, opened an old book, and for the first time in many months, I read without being interrupted by the fear of being pushed out of my own home. It was over, not in a loud way, but in the right way. I learned about Jason being kicked out of the apartment in a very ordinary way. There was no phone call, no official notice. Just one afternoon, while I was watering the garden beds on the front porch, Daniel from next door walked over, leaned against the fence, watched me for a moment, and then said, "Jason got moved out." I didn't ask right away. My hand stayed on the hose. The water kept flowing steadily into the soil. Daniel said that earlier that morning a rental truck had been parked near the apartment complex at the end of the street. The back was open. Items were carried down one by one. Not much. An old sofa, a few boxes of clothes, a plastic shoe rack with a chipped corner. He recognized them because he had seen them before, in my house, in the room Jason had occupied for all those temporary years. "It didn't look like a real move," Daniel said, "more like being cleared out in a hurry." Jason stood under the apartment awning, wrinkled button-down shirt, faded jeans, head lowered. Brooke stood nearby, arms crossed, constantly checking her phone. She pointed at the movers, snapping at them like someone had messed up her plan. Daniel didn't say Jason cried. He didn't say he begged. He only said Jason signed some papers, waited, then got into the truck last. "Evicted for not paying rent," Daniel concluded. "The manager there said it straight." I turned off the hose, put it back exactly where it belonged. Not because I was shocked, but because I'd heard enough. "Do you want to know where they went?" Daniel asked. I shook my head. Daniel nodded as if he'd expected that. He handed me a beer he had already brought. Said nothing else. Asked nothing. Just sat down with me on the porch steps. "How does it feel?" he asked after a while. I thought for a few seconds. Didn't look for a clever answer. Just said what was true. "Empty." Daniel didn't react. He took a sip, looked out at the street. The neighborhood looked the same as always. Someone walking a dog past. The sound of a garage door opening and closing. Life went on, neat and cold in its own way. That evening I went inside and locked the door. The click of the lock sounded solid. I set the keys down on the table, right next to the neatly tied folder of documents. I didn't open it again. I didn't need to. I walked through the house once. Living room, kitchen, study. Everything was where it belonged. Nothing missing. Nothing extra. Just a house. I thought about Jason, but not much. No anger. No pity. Just a fact, put back in its proper place. He chose his path. I chose what remained. That night, I slept deeply. No dreams, no sudden waking. In the morning, I made coffee and opened the door to let the light in. Another ordinary day began, and I knew, very clearly, some victories aren't meant to be celebrated. They exist only to confirm that we refused to disappear. Everything ended without needing further explanation. No one called it a victory. No one celebrated. It was just a house returned to its rightful place, and one person allowed to remain where they belonged. Some fractures cannot be repaired. Some relationships, once they cross a line, leave only one option: to keep yourself from breaking any further. I carried no bitterness. I kept no fragile hope. I simply chose to keep living with what was still standing, and that was enough. If you've listened this far, maybe you understand what it feels like to be pushed out of someone else's life in a very reasonable way. If this story made you pause for a moment, leave a single period in the comments. No need to explain anything. If you want to keep hearing stories where the truth doesn't need to shout, subscribe to the channel. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them, as a reminder that silence does not mean disappearance. Thank you for listening.